Good evening. Welcome, as usual, to our AJA Zoom event, both to our regulars and any new people this week. Welcome also to those watching on Facebook and to anybody listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio. That's at FM 88 in Melbourne or at j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and you will have already seen David Adler, who's President of the AJA. Also with us is our guest tonight, Rabbi Ben Packer, and the topic is Jerusalem Day, the good, the bad and the ugly. The format will be an interview-style discussion with Robert, David and myself, and then we'll take questions. If you do want to ask a question and you're not familiar with how we work, you need to raise your hand electronically, and the way to do that is click on the reactions icon down at the bottom of the screen, and that gives you the option of raising your hand. The chat function is open, and written questions can be placed on the chat, and Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, will read some of them out during question time. And of course, if you don't like the chat, you can very easily disable it. Okay, so Yom Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem Day, commemorates the liberation and subsequent reunification of Jerusalem under Jewish sovereignty following the Six-Day War. It is a day of immense pride to the Jewish world, but not without its controversies, particularly the annual flag march, which typically passes through the Muslim quarter in the old city of Jerusalem, which many Palestinian Arabs view as an act of provocation. However, the route has been changed in recent years when the security situation required it. Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas have in previous years fired rockets towards Israel, and this year, as usual, the Palestinian factions issued lots of threats. To bring us up to date with all this, we're delighted to be joined by Rabbi Ben Packer, who is the director and, in his words, the supreme commander of the Jlem Heritage House, which is an organisation that offers its young guests an opportunity to tour Israel and experience Jewish culture. And we might ask him about that a little later. Ben, welcome to Australia via Zoom, and thank you for your time.
We're happy to be here with y'all.
Okay, I'm going to first of all hand over to Robert Gregory, who will start the discussion going, and then David and I can join in.
All right, thank you for joining us, Rabbi. And to set the scene, could you give us an overview of what happens in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day? How much of a celebration is it? We're seeing reports that 70,000 people marched. Is that the case? And is it, in general, and in Israel, is it a public holiday? What happens in other cities?
Wow. Okay, I would say the 70,000 number, that's referring to the parade itself, but there are many other celebrations going on besides the parade. The most notable would be at the Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, the yeshiva that was founded by Rabbi Cook, the first chief rabbi. There's a massive celebration there the night of Yom Yerushalayim. And historically, political figures have attended, and many people go to that, and the dancing goes on for hours and hours. After that, there is a very large prayer service at the Western Wall, but also throughout synagogues, throughout Jerusalem. There are very celebratory, prayer services and things like that. So there are many more participants than just the 70,000. I would start by saying. Jerusalem Day is not an official holiday of the state. So it doesn't mean that, so people don't get the day off from work and things like they would on, for example, in the Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day. So it's not the same as that. But in Jerusalem, certainly it's a very big deal. And many streets are closed for the parade and other activities. It's a very big celebration of the Jewish return, although, and we'll probably talk about this at some point later, is that the main participants of these activities are from what's called the religious Zionist community. I would say upwards of 95%, maybe more, are participants of that community, the community that wears knitted kippahs, and that community is the main group participating in the festivities on Jerusalem Day.
Ben, does that mean that the secular citizens of Israel are not all that interested in Jerusalem Day, or are they interested but just don't want to participate to the same extent?
It's a very good question. I don't know exactly how to frame it, but I would say that there are a lot of holidays around that time period. We have Passover, we have Yom Ha'atzmaut, and then we have Shavuos. There's a lot going on. For another day holiday, it can be a bit much. I would say that the overwhelming majority of the secular community, of course, is very happy about Jerusalem Day, but to travel to Jerusalem and participate in it, that seems to be just this one community that's willing to do that.
And what happens in Tel Aviv? Do they take much of an interest, or is life just going on as normal there?
I think life pretty much goes on as normal there. I would imagine in various synagogues, there would be celebratory prayer services, but outside of the synagogues, besides the occasional barbecue somebody may throw on their rooftop or something, I think it's not such a big day in Tel Aviv.
Yeah. Now, the reports suggested that that some ultra-nationalist Jewish Israelis attacked some Palestinians many times under the eyes of Israeli police. That's the report that comes out in newspapers like The Guardian. How do you respond to that?
I would say that, well, I can't obviously comment on every single incident that took place. However, I would say that, again, overwhelmingly, again, in the high 90%, any incidents that take place are Jews responding to attacks from Arabs. And that's true in general in Israel, but it's also true on Jerusalem Day. All the attacks that I'm aware of, personally, were all the result of the Arabs starting. Now, that doesn't mean that the response wasn't, as they say, disproportionate. It may have been, but they're all in response to the attacks. And I think that one of the terming of the parade as a provocation, I think, and just in general, the conflict, friction of the parade, I think a lot of that is the result of the fact that maybe people don't realize that the Jews are attacked regularly in Jerusalem, unfortunately, especially where the parade takes place. That is unfortunately very, very common. And many Jews avoid the area because of that. So, of course, when the parade comes and the Jews, so to speak, have the numbers and the Arabs still attack them, it's not so surprising that the response is not so restrained.
And reports coming from some of the Arab media say that Jews are chanting phrases like "death to the Arabs." Has that been verified? And do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I'm sure that happens. That's that is not a pretty thing to see or hear, but it definitely happens. I would say it's a small minority, and I would again emphasize that it's in the response to the actions of the other side, not necessarily a justifiable response, but nonetheless, it is a response, and it is the result, I think, on the most part, of frustration with the constant attacks and the constant attempts at intimidation and things of that nature against anyone Jewish who dares to walk in those areas.
And I want to ask you about the route of the flag march. Now, they do walk through the Muslim quarter of the old city. Presumably, that would be very provocative to the locals there. Is there a particular reason that the march goes through that particular part of the city?
It's a very good question. I personally, I'll just say my opinion. I don't want to say my opinion a lot here, but I'll say my opinion is I don't understand why that's the best route. The soldiers who conquered the old city in 1967 came through the Lions Gate. And the Lions Gate is on the northeast side of the old city. Now, granted, in order to access the Lions Gate from Western Jerusalem, it would be logistically more difficult and require walking through areas that are predominantly Arab. But it seems to me that that's the route that makes the most sense to enter the old city from the route that the soldiers themselves entered. But Shechem, the Shechem gate or Damascus gate, as the Arabs call it, is somewhat of a compromise. And then instead of walking all the way around to the Lion's Gate, they go through that gate because it faces the western side of the old city. The parade itself, as we mentioned before, is predominantly religious, observant people, and it is separate. It's gender separated between men and women, and the women use the Jaffa Gate, and the men use the Shechem Gate or Damascus Gate. So from a purely practical point of view, that does make the most sense, even if it doesn't line up historically with the actions of the war. And
then they all meet at the Kotel. So what happens at that point?
At the Kotel, there's a large concert, and music is played, is done. Of course, people pray as well, and they normally fill the plaza pretty solidly. And the separation is again also still in place, obviously, like it is always at the wall, including in the back area, the large plaza area. But everybody ends up there. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Ben, can I ask you, what's the feeling of having a reunited Jerusalem? Does that have pretty well universal support in Israel and politically? Are there any groundswell for a redivision of the city to create a state of Palestine? And I understand there is some laws about the status of Jerusalem now. Can you comment on that?
So I don't think there's much support for a division of Jerusalem. And if there is support, it's normally talking about outlying villages that were added to Jerusalem after 67, mostly in the northern section of Jerusalem. But in terms of the old city and the areas around the old city, I think most Israelis are pretty solidly supportive of that staying part of Israel, regardless of anything else. Of course, the oldest Jewish cemetery in the world, the Mount of Olives, is to the east of the old city. The city of David, which would be a very prominent archaeological site, and things of that nature. I don't think many Israelis are too keen to part with those things at this point. Jerusalem is recognized by Israel as part of Israel, as part of sovereign Israel, and Israeli law applies in full to all parts of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So legally speaking, according, at least from an Israeli point of view, Jerusalem is totally part of Israel.
The reason I ask that question is because the Australian government policy officially is only to recognise West Jerusalem, whatever that is, as the capital of Israel, whereas the Australian Jewish Association, our organisation, says clearly and publicly that Jerusalem should be the eternal, undivided capital of Israel.
I would just say that there's a lot of political positions taken by governments and other people that are not very well attuned with the realities on the ground. Mm-hmm. And that I will stumble into somewhat controversial waters here, but one of the most amazing parts of the President Trump peace plan that I don't necessarily agree with, but nonetheless, he took the plan. One of the most impressive parts of the plan was that it did take into account the reality on the ground to a large degree. Yeah. And it's shocking how many political positions of, so to speak, enlightened countries do not take in the realities on the ground and present somewhat of a mythical view of the situation.
Does it concern you that Jewish organisations might even take those sort of political positions and advocate East Jerusalem for a capital of something else?
It concerns me greatly, not just because it's a policy that I think is very flawed. I think oftentimes it shows an ignorance that is embarrassing and very disappointing very disappointing.
Well, I'm going to share with you and our group a document, and it should be on the screen now. It's a document we obtained from a government file from the Zionist Federation of Australia, and I've put some marks on it. It was a submission, and if you look at this paragraph, it was when Australia was considering the status of Jerusalem and whether we should move the embassy. And this is from a body that calls itself the Zionist Federation of Australia, basically saying the Australian government recognising East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state in the context of a peace agreement or something like that. And that's from an organisation here that calls itself Zionist. So it seems to be a real problem. Do you get that around the world?
Oh, definitely. It's a big problem within the Jewish world that it's probably the biggest problem to some degree. I mean, again, it's hard to understand how people who could profess such an opinion could actually be aware of the realities on the ground here. I mean, are they suggesting that the Western Wall should be part of a Palestinian state? Are they suggesting that Mount of Olives should be part of a Palestinian state? What about the tens of thousands of Israelis that live in this area? I would have so many questions. I wouldn't be sure where to start on such policies, but are not uncommon, and it is very confusing.
Well, I'd like to hand back to Robert, and Robert can ask you a little bit more about the work that you do in Jerusalem and the organisation that you head.
Yeah, would you be able to tell us a bit more about the Heritage House, what you do, what you're involved in Jerusalem, in Israel, and how
Sure.
Australian Jews might be able to get involved?
Yeah, so we have a facility here in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem where we host young travelers, lone soldiers, participants in different programs, people after birthright trips. And we host them here. They have where to stay and be safe. But we also enable them to experience real Jerusalem. As we've been talking now, there's a lot of false information out there and a lot of misconception. And when you're actually here, it's the perfect time to see what's really going on. So we'll take them to the places where they can see what's really going on. And of course, many times it's very confusing for them because, you know, they are aware of the news and different things, and then they're very confused when they see the reality on the ground. But that's how you learn. And so that's what we do. And we are, of course, very pro-Israel, very pro-Jewish, and very pro-Jewish identity. And so we feel that being aware of these situations and being knowledgeable can greatly strengthen their Jewish identity and their feeling of connection to the Jewish people. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So that's what we're doing.
Yes, Ben, so how is your organisation funded? Does it receive government funding, or are you purely at the...
No, we are fully funded by Jewish donors around the world. We do not charge our guests for anything. Everybody comes with different financial backgrounds, so we don't really have time to deal with that. We host the people for free, and we do their laundry for free, and we offer them tours for free, and service projects that they can work on. For now, for instance, we have a program right now, a project in the old city of a Jewish property that has had some kind of collapse, and there's a lot of debris in the property, and our guests are shoveling out the debris to get it ready for a Jewish family. So it's very exciting. And of course, it's not lost on the guests that they're the ones able to participate in this rebuilding of Jerusalem. They love it, and it's great for everyone. And
Ben, there are organisations that facilitate the purchase of properties from Arab owners. Is that anything you get involved with?
Sure. So of course we work with the Terra Kohanim, who is at the forefront here in the old city, that, Daniel Luria from Melbourne.
Yes, we know Daniel.
They're doing spectacular work and having incredible success. The City of David, of course, is doing very well. And I'm working with all of them. We're working with all of them. Also, I'm more personally dealing with what's called the Israel Land Fund, founded by Aryeh King, Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. And we're involved mostly in what's called the Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood and areas in southern Jerusalem and northern Jerusalem right now. There's a lot of great people doing great stuff. We try to work with everybody. Everyone's got the same goals.
And Ben, the people that you host in your heritage house, are there any criteria that have to be met for them to be hosted by you? Are there age limits or anything?
Yes, it's very similar to the birthright criteria of Taglit. We're primarily under 30 and Jewish, but by a loose definition, mostly identifying as Jewish. That's you need to be on some, we don't host people forever. So it's some kind of plan there, but as long as, things are going well, we're happy to host.
Yes. Now, I want to ask you about the Temple Mount, because that's always a source of controversy and always features in the violence between Jewish Israelis and Arabs. Just remind us how important this site is to Judaism, and then tell us why it isn't under Israeli control.
So, of course, the Temple Mount is paramount of Jewish. It's really the only holy place that we really have. We revere other sites such as the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron and places like that. But in terms of holiness, the Temple Mount is the place. It's where the temple stood. It's where we believe the temple will stand in the future. There are many aspects of Jewish law that can only take place on the Temple Mount, or at least around the Temple Mount. And without the Temple Mount and without the temple, they can't be done. So we're that is a major part of Judaism as a religion, as a culture, and as a people. We have a law that 3 times a year Jews are supposed to ascend to the Temple Mount during the holidays. That's a big deal. That affects everybody. It should affect everybody, and it unfortunately does not right now. And there's just numerous, hundreds, literally hundreds of Jewish mitzvahs that are centered around the Temple Mount. Of course, all of Jerusalem that we have is also centered around the Temple Mount. That's the whole. That is the epicenter of everything. And I would say, in terms of the problems there currently, it's another good example of what we talked about before. There are many accusations in the media that I'm sure you've seen that the Israeli police are somehow magically starting up with Muslim worshipers on the Temple Mount, I guess just because they feel like it or they're bored. And that is complete nonsense. It's such nonsense that it's hard to even read such things and take seriously. Every time the police respond on the Temple Mount, it's a response to violence coming from the other side. There's no, police action on the Temple Mount where the police just decide to go there and cause trouble and attack Muslim worshipers. That's completely absurd. And you'll never see any evidence of it because it's completely absurd. It's ridiculous. And all police action on the Temple Mount is in response to not only aggression towards them, but often aggression towards Jewish visitors, also to the Temple Mount, but also to the Temple Mount, and also to the areas around the Temple Mount. I myself, I can say, do not visit the Temple Mount for religious reasons. But I myself have been attacked around the area of the Temple Mount by people attacking people who go to the Temple Mount, by Arabs attacking people who go to the Temple Mount. So it's not restricted to the Mount, it spills over. And of course, it's the major site of controversy if you really want to break down the entire situation.
And just tell us, if you can, Ben, simply why it is inappropriate for Jews to ascend the Temple Mount at this moment. Well,
there's differences of opinions on that. There are some rabbis who hold that Jews should go up, and other rabbis who hold that not only can they, but they should go up. So that there are differences of opinion within the rabbinical world about that. Historically, would mean in the last few decades, most rabbis have been opposed. Today, we kind of see a trend of more rabbis allowing it. That is a bit of a controversial thing within Jewish law, but the numbers of Jews going up is certainly skyrocketing. I mean, on Yom Yerushalayim, on Jerusalem Day, 2,600 Jews went up. That's more than went up in whole years.
And was that legal or illegal?
According to Israeli law?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
That's legal. Jews are allowed. The Jews and other non-Muslims are legally allowed to enter the Temple Mount from the entrance called the Mugrabi Gate, which is near the Western Wall. And you're allowed to go up. You have to go through a security check. Jews are supervised on the Mount. Non-Jews are not necessarily supervised. Jews are supervised both by Israeli police and by Jordanian appointed Waqf officials of the Islamic Trust that supervises the Mount. And technically, Jews are not supposed to pray on the Temple Mount, although we do see that changing, at least on the ground there. And that is, by the way, one of the things the Muslims are very upset about, at least they claim to be very upset about, is this trend of more Jews going on the Temple Mount and then being more active as Jews on the Temple Mount. That does appear to be a trend that the Arabs are not making up. They are there and they are noticing it, and they're not happy with it.
And we do see, we have seen clips of the Palestinian Arabs using the mosque as a launching pad for rock throwing. So was this part of their Jerusalem Day protests?
It's not just Jerusalem Day, it's many other days as well. It's not uncommon at all. They know that the police at least do not want to go into the mosque, do not want to be involved with that situation. So it's their place where they can best prepare their attacks. But this is it's not uncommon, and it's not new. This has been going on for decades. And the idea that the police, again, I'll just repeat because it's just so absurd. The idea that the police unilaterally just decide to attack Muslim worshipers on the Temple Mount because they don't have what else to do is, so divorced from reality. It's hard to even believe people write that down.
And the other part of my question, and then we'll go to the audience, is why isn't the Temple Mount under Israeli control?
Well, historically, the short answer is because Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister in 1967, gave control of the Temple Mount to the Waqf, the Muslim organization, to supervise, to have custodianship on the Temple Mount. And today that is connected with Jordan. They administer that Waqf financially. And the answer is that it's good for relations with Jordan, and it removed the Israeli leaders from having to deal with the Temple Mount and what was going to go on there. And so it was,
and this happened very
expediency.
Yes, and this happened very shortly after Jerusalem was liberated, didn't it?
I believe 3 days is the
yes.
standard.
And would most people consider that was a mistake in hindsight?
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people, yes, do, but it has allowed Israel to avoid issues of, meaning historically we know that Jews prayed on the Temple Mount historically. Whether or not that was okay or not can be debated, but we know that happened. Okay, we know that besides the temples, there were other times where Jews had structures on the Temple Mount that they used for religious activity. Okay, so what is stopping us from doing that today? Well, it's very convenient to blame the Muslims for it. They're obviously very against it. So if we give them control, then we can blame them for not allowing it. not as uncommon as you might think. It's a pretty common way of dealing with things. So, but in terms of the violence and stuff, it's like anything else. If you let a situation go on and fester, then it will get worse. And that is what we see now. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to audience questions. Just before we do, I will mention that if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Rabbi Ben Packer, and we're talking about Jerusalem Day and some of the violence that ensued, as always happens every year. Just before we move on to questions, I'll hand back to David for a moment, and he can tell us what's coming up next week.
Thank you very much, Alan. And as we always do, AJA needs your support to do the important work that we do. If anyone here is not yet a member or hasn't made a contribution, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au and rectify that. For daily news and views items, like and follow the Australian Jewish Association Facebook page. And if you know any associates, family, etc., who might be interested, we're very close to getting 20,000 followers of our Facebook page, by far the largest in Australia for a Jewish organisation, and we'd like to tip over that landmark very soon. Now, as far as next week is concerned, we have a very special personality joining us, Walter Bingham, who holds the Guinness Book of World Records for being the oldest radio broadcaster. He's made Aliyah to Israel. He's still very active, 98 years old, a remarkable person, and we'll set another record next week with him being the oldest guest for AJA. So it should be a fascinating, and he's a wonderful personality, very sharp.
Thanks, David. Yes, Walter's seen a lot of history, so it will be interesting to ask him about it. Okay, question time. I've got Hugh, Leon, Dennis and Andy. So we'll start with you, Hugh. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good morning, Rabbi Packer from England. I was in Jerusalem last week for the Jerusalem prayer breakfast, and one of the keynote speakers was David Friedman, the former US ambassador to Israel, who was responsible, or he was at the center of moving the Jerusalem, their embassy to Jerusalem, and also the Abraham Accords. I'm going to briefly make some comments of what he said, and I'm going to ask you for your take on what he said. First of all, he said that the Abraham Accords never intended that Israel should renounce any sovereign claim to Judea and Samaria, but merely to delay exercising sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria. He also went on to say that Israel needs to grow up and actually exercise that sovereignty, because nations don't respect a nation that doesn't have a respect for its own heritage. And so he's encouraging Israel to do just that. And I just wonder what you think of that.
I think, first of all, David Friedman was spectacular as ambassador. It's hard to even quantify the amazing change brought to that office, just in so many ways. I remember seeing him come to the Western Walls on Friday night, which of course was never done before by an ambassador. And he would come and he would dance with the birthright groups, and many of them wouldn't even know who he was. And of course he couldn't take the pictures. He couldn't, it was Shabbat. And he would just, it was just so natural to him. And it was so beautiful to see. I remember seeing it so many Friday nights and just thinking, just how unbelievable, and then we'd have the ceremony at the Western Wall of the blessing of the priests, the Birkas Kohanim, and he is a Kohen, and he would participate because, of course, why would he not participate? At the same time, he was the first ever to participate. Again, so just absolutely remarkable. I would say, yeah, I mean, his point is very accurate and very harsh. It is not the ambassador. I remember one time a friend of mine, his wife had a baby in their house in Hebron, and they wanted Hebron, Israel, put on the American passport, and because they're American. And I called Connection in the embassy, and I said, is this possible? And they said, no, it's not possible. We can't recognize Hebron as part of Israel if Israel doesn't.
Mm.
So yeah, and that was a little, not the answer I was looking for, but true at the same time. Yeah, we need to put on our big boy pants here, or whatever you want to call it, big boy and big girl pants, and big girl skirt, and yeah, we need to do what needs to be done, and we can't constantly look to our big friend America and say, what do you think? Of course, whether it was a good idea or not to delay sovereignty in order for the Abraham Accords to be easier or more easily digestible to the Arab public, I don't know. That's a very interesting question, whether that was a good idea or not. But I think he's 100% accurate, and of course he is, that it's just a delay. It's not a giving up. I mean, there are certain, again, to emphasize the Trump peace plan, again, just to look at it and realize that it took into account the realities on the ground to such an extent that nobody else, unfortunately, does. There's no denying the fact that there will be Israeli sovereignty in Gush Etzion. Of course there will. I mean, of course there will be. In the Jordan Valley, of course there will be. Will it be tomorrow? Will it be next week? Will it be 5-10 years from now? I don't know.
Made any difference to? Has the Biden administration made any difference to your life on a daily basis?
I would say not really. The Trump administration certainly did. They were extremely active. The Biden administration, they've had a very rough time. If their real goal was to make changes that matter, they've had a rough time. I mean, I think President Biden has now delayed his trip to Israel and maybe even canceled it. They've attempted to reopen a consulate to the Palestinian Authority, which has not been successful. They've had a lot of false starts, I guess you could say. And they have a lot of other issues that seem to be their priorities, which probably should be their priorities. Again, to follow, I don't want to make excuses for the Biden administration, but I would just say, or for the current ambassador, but to follow the Trump administration and the David Friedman, not an easy thing to follow up. I mean, that's a tough gig there. So again, they have not been very active. No, the answer is no.
Okay, Leon. Leon doesn't have a camera, but please unmute yourself and ask your question, Leon.
Yes, good evening, Rabbi. Australian time, that is, good evening. Does your organisation interact with the foreign media to try to dispel many of the myths that they create?
It's a very good question, but no, we don't in general. Not as an organization. As an organization, we are dealing with our guests primarily, and we don't have political, so to speak, opinions or things like that, other than for educational purposes. I would also just say that personally, I find it to be not very productive to deal with hostile media. There are people out there, people like Yishai Fleischer, and who are very adept at dealing with these hostile media organizations. But if you're not, I think it's probably a bad idea. Even if you are, it might be a bad idea. But certainly, if you're not, it's a bad idea. And your views, your words can be distorted very easily. I just witnessed a video recently where I was very surprised to see Aryeh King, who I mentioned before, Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, to speak to Al Jazeera. I was very surprised. And I only found out later that he didn't speak to them. They took an interview from somebody else and pretended like they did it. So even I was fooled in that respect. So I think speaking to foreign media, I personally would differentiate between friendly media or even objective media and hostile media. And I think speaking to hostile media is a bad idea. If there is such a thing as a media or friendly media, I have no problem speaking to them. But I think that you always must use a certain level of caution and understand your strengths when doing so.
Okay, we'll go to Dennis. Now, there's a message on the, I think on the chat from Ellie, who wants to ask a question. So we'll go to Dennis first. But Ellie, I will ask you to raise your hand electronically because we need to unmute you. And it's a bit hard to find people unless they've got their hand raised. So if you can do that, we'll come to you next. So Dennis, fire away.
All right. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Now, the fact that the Waqf control the Temple Mount and the Jews can't pray there, I'd put it to you, makes it look to the outside world, the non-Jewish world, as if we, in fact, doubt our own heritage. I put that point to you. Now, does that not make the world look at us and say, well, do you really own this if you have ceded this control and kept it that way? That's one. Number two, seeing that it's Jordan that controls the Waqf, we have a reasonable, or Israel has a reasonable relationship with Jordan, given that Israel now has an abundant gas supply, which they could easily sell at discounted rates to Jordan. Is there an opportunity for the Israeli government to negotiate with Jordan some changes to the Jewish access to the Temple Mount?
So I think, according to your first point, yes, it's a real point, and it's somewhat depressing. But it's not just by the Temple Mount. Think about, for example, the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron. If you've been there, you see that it's very underdeveloped, and now they're building an access for handicap, which of course is a law in Israel, but only now, after years of objections from the Arabs. So there's a lot of places, unfortunately, like this, and it needs work, let's say. And the second part was, remind me.
It was about the gas that it made.
Yes, Jordan. I have to admit, I do study these things, but I am constantly confused by the Israeli relationship with Jordan. I don't know why we have a relationship with Jordan. I'm not sure why Jordan's a country. It's all very weird to me. But I will say that Jordan is under tremendous pressure from their citizens and non-citizen inhabitants who are very anti-Israel in general. And so I don't think Jordan will move on that at all. The only thing that could move Jordan on that is Saudi Arabia. If they do not get along, and if Saudi Arabia were to improve relations with Israel, which according to at least media reports does appear to be the direction things are going, if our relations with Saudi Arabia were to improve, that would definitely put Jordan in a very not nice situation where they would very much have to worry about their future on the mountain. Keep in mind that Saudi Arabia are the ones who removed Jordan from Mecca and Medina to begin with. So they don't have a great history. And again, I don't know, the whole concept of Jordan is a bit of a mystery to me. Israel definitely has tremendous power over Jordan in terms of gas, in terms of water as well. Israel provides a lot of water to Jordan. And Jordan seems to be like that employee who doesn't behave very often. And I don't know why we don't fire them.
Okay. So Ellie, if you unmute yourself and ask your question, and then we'll go to Andy.
Thank you, Rabbi Packer, for your most enlightening talk. I was just asking in relation to the current government and its reliance on the support of an Arab party. What's the general opinion in Israel with regard to that, especially in light of what happened just yesterday, when they weren't able to, pass one of the most basic Zionistic laws?
I would say that it's very problematic. I wouldn't say it's problematic primarily because they're Arabs. I would say the problem is that they're anti-Israel. There are pro-Arab, pro-Israel Arabs, and I don't think many people would have too much of a problem with their political activity in the Knesset. The problem is that the two Arab parties that are currently in the Knesset are openly anti-Israel. But I wouldn't limit it to only the Arab parties as well. I mean, in the government, we have the Meretz party is also not, so pro-Israel, I would say. So I wouldn't, they call themselves the Arab parties, they primarily are made up of Arabs and vote on Arabs. But the problem is not that they're Arab. The problem is that they don't support the state and they actively work against it. And the fact that people who actively work against the state are members of the government is, it makes even less sense than Jordan, honestly. I don't know how to explain that. How can a government rely on people who actively oppose the state? I mean, there was a forum in the Knesset yesterday that called for all Israeli citizens to not join the army so that the country will collapse. I mean, and that's in the Knesset. That took place in the Knesset, which is just, I'm not anti-democracy, but I think there are limits. And certainly, besides, I don't know why they're allowed in the Knesset to begin with, but besides that, the fact that the government relies on them is frankly pathetic. It's pathetic. It's I don't know, without to get into too political, but I don't know how Naftali Bennett could possibly justify, and not just him, the other people with him, how they can justify this situation. Again, not because they're Arabs, but because they're anti the state of Israel. I don't understand that. It's not a good look.
No, I don't understand it either. Andy, let's go to you. So please unmute yourself as you have and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm an American who lives in Israel. I've lived here for 16 years, and I've experienced a lot of things. With my Israeli passport, I wasn't allowed to attend a trip with a Canadian group to Bethlehem because I'm an Israeli with an Israeli passport. The media doesn't know about that. When you have guests at your place, are they taught, or do people tell them what's actually happening in this country? I mean, I have a Palestinian doctor. I go to the Druze, I go to the Bedouins, and one-on-one, there's no problem. But there's so much hate. How do we eliminate it? How do we educate? We cannot change those that hate, but there's so many on the wall. What do we do?
Well, I think, like you said, just seeing is believing. Like, that situation with Bethlehem, of course, I'm very well aware of that situation, but many people are not. The idea that Jews can't go into Bethlehem or can't go to a lot of places, even Jericho and other places, is very shocking to a lot of people, and they're not aware of that. It's very hard to really fathom the amount of disinformation that's out there. It is, as they call it in America, fake news, right? But it is tremendous. I mean, you see people who are, relatively educated, talking about how Arabs don't have access to one road in Hebron, where there's only one road in all of Hebron that Jews do have access to. I mean, how can they not, see the situation for what it is? But the answer is, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, the word that people don't want to use, but there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and there is a lot of ignorance. I can just say that I brought a group one time of guests in the Heritage House. We went to a bris, a circumcision, north of Jerusalem in the Binyamin region. And these were students at Duke University. All right. These were students at Duke University, which is a very prominent university in America. And they were staring off into the hilltops. And I said, "Hi, fellas, are you okay?" And they said, "Listen, we're very confused. This is not what we expected to see here. We expected to see Arabs behind fences and a giant open air concentration camp. And we're seeing hundreds of empty hilltops and beautiful palaces. We're going to need a few minutes, so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of ignorance. I don't want the birthright trip in the past. I don't know about now. In the past, it's always claimed that they avoid Judea and Samaria, the West Bank as they call it. But I, of course, am aware that many of their trips stay in the West Bank and in Judea. They stay in the Jordan Valley, and that's certainly but the students don't even know. They're not even aware. So I think, yes, certainly at our organization, we are doing the best we can to spread the real information and the real situation. And of course, those red signs that you see that bar Jews from areas, we go up to them and we read them, so they're aware of it. But, it is complicated, and there's a lot of information and a tremendous amount of ignorance.
Yeah, and one of my pet hates is the way everybody uses the wrong terminology, i.e., occupation, settlements, West Bank, and a lot of that comes from Israel. So would you not say that
a lot of it comes from Israel, but a lot of it they wouldn't. Unfortunately, and sorry, I'm talking mostly about American Jews, but the cluelessness is just that's perfect. Yes, the cluelessness is just on an extremely high level, and it's unfortunate, but it's where we are, and we need to do better. We need to do better as the Jewish people, specifically. We need to do better. I'm sure your organization is working on that, but we need to do better in terms of educating our youth and everybody else. It's there's the amount of ignorance out there is like the fact that she can't go into Beit Lechem would probably shock. There's probably people who won't even believe that if you told them. But of course it's true. Of course it's true. Of course I know it's true. But people wouldn't even believe that. They would think that's impossible.
Yeah. Robert has some written questions, I think. So far away, Robert.
Yeah, just a couple of written questions. So John's asked how he can connect his Christian friends to your organization. Do you do anything for that? And then Jason has asked, to what degree is the Waqf complicit or at least permissive of the violence that's fomented from within the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
So according to the first thing, of course, I'm happy to speak to Christians. I went to Catholic school as a child, but in terms of the organization, since we have a religious element, we're not hosting Christian guests. We don't want proselytization or anything like that to go on. So we're not hosting Christian guests, but certainly for tours and things like that, certainly happy to indulge Christians as anybody else. In terms of the Waqf, I mean, listen, they certainly aren't against the violence, that's for sure. Violence is certainly good for them. It's good for their business model. I mean, if people realized how much the Muslim population of the old city is sponsored from outside, is artificially, financially, sponsored, whether it's the Waqf or whether it's other organizations financially funding the Muslim population to stay here, they'd be shocked. They'd be shocked if that funding were to dry up. You would see some massive demographic shifts here very quickly. So the Waqf, they're very happy to make their money and to work very little. So they're not looking to lose that job. But any problems around the Temple Mount seem to always result in more jobs for them. So I don't know how much they participate in it because they don't want to lose their jobs, but I'm sure they're cheering from the sides as much as possible.
Ben, you talk about a business model, and I've often thought that the Palestinian Arabs, they have a very good little business model working for themselves. They don't have to work.
But I'm sorry to interrupt, but only for some of them.
How so?
If you're part of only if you toe the party line, otherwise you're out.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to say they don't have to work. They complain to all of the world organizations, and everybody throws money at them. Why would they even want to settle the conflict? Because that would mean they would have to start working for a living and setting up a functioning society.
Yeah, that would make no sense at all, and that's why they're not doing it.
So in terms, we in the Australian Jewish Association often talk about the two-state delusion. Do you have any particular thoughts as to how the conflict could be best resolved so we just don't go on like this for decade after decade?
Well, I think that the solution to the conflict, it is that we need to be stronger and stronger and stronger. And the stronger we are, the better the situation will be. That's just the reality. The Arabs are not, they're not going to, keep running their heads against the wall. They realize that once we're strong, they will back off. We're not going anywhere. That's not an option. So what is an option? An option is to live in peace. Well, how can we do that? Well, the only way we can live in peace is for us to be strong. That's it. Strong. Then we won't be in peace, and so that's it. That's the only option we have. And I think the global Jewish community needs to understand how much of this conflict is actually international, and that the Muslim side is basically only in this fight because of the assistance they get from outside. And they're Jews should at least be as involved as they are. We Jews believe that this land belongs to all of us. The Muslims don't really believe that. A Muslim in Pakistan or another country doesn't really believe it's his land. He may believe that the Muslims are entitled to it, but not him himself. He has something to do with him. Whereas Jews, we all believe that it is ours, not just the Jewish people's, but ours individually. We have a stake in this, both for our security, both religiously and also nationally. It's a family inheritance. So we should all be taking an active role in this.
And Ben, I imagine some of the progressive organisations like the New Israel Fund and J Street cause you huge difficulties. Do people join your tours and as your guests? Do they sometimes say, "Well, we saw what the New Israel Fund said," and then you have to go to great lengths to correct them?
I would say I wouldn't say it's never happened, but I would say it's uncommon. I think we overestimate the success of our enemies sometimes. I think there are a lot of talk and a lot less action. They claim to have the ears of Jewish youth, but I think that's very removed from the reality. Nobody has the ears of the Jewish youth. That's the problem. We need to get that. Our competition is not necessarily the New Israel Fund or those expressive enemies, but just the regular culture of the world and things like that. We need to get in the ears of our young Jewish people. And in terms of the people who are against us, yeah, of course they're problematic. They would like to be a lot worse than they are, I would say. They would like to be. I don't have too many people come in here and complain about going to Hebron. I don't have too many people complain. As a matter of fact, I even had a guy here one time who is supposedly a leftist. He's a leftist. And when we were in Hebron, he asked if he could do some work to help the community there, just that it not be videoed.
Really? Okay.
Now we are other Jewish organizations that are not considered leftist, I would say are more moderate, that have also asked to participate but not be videoed because they're afraid of the backlash. So I would say, in my experience, although that's not a great situation, they don't want to be videoed. But on the other hand, this whole idea that the New Israel Fund and these other bad actors, people like Peter Bainhart,
yes,
an influencer. I don't think I maybe 1% or less of my guests have ever even heard of him.
Really?
If they ever hear him is the sign on the wall that says he's not welcome here. So, you know, that's the first time they hear Peter Bainhart, number 15. But nobody, I mean, these people are not influencers, and not, at least not when it comes to young Jewish people. Unfortunately, nobody is influencing them from the Jewish world, and we need to do a better job.
Absolutely.
Okay, and well, that's very encouraging, and I'm pleased to hear that. Now, we have come up to time, so we need to finish. Rabbi Ben Packer, I want to thank you for being such an articulate spokesman for Jerusalem and for the Jewish people, and for defending the Jewish claim to Jerusalem. Now, I did put the web link of your Heritage House up on the chat. So if anybody wants to take advantage of your hospitality, what do they do?
Well, we are hosting young people primarily under the age of 30, but if anyone knows people coming on birthright trips or anything like that, or on a holiday or whatever, please put them in touch with us and we can see what works for them. Sometimes people want to stay with us, but sometimes they just want to join a tour or a project or just get information. Happy to do it.
And do people need to set this up in advance, or do you have people just turning up and?
We're you know, in the Jewish world, a lot of times they say 24/6. You know, we're 24/7, including Yom Kippur. So.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Ben. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and we wish you a big Yasher Koach and all the best with your work. Thank you for joining the AJA today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Hope to be back.
Okay, just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is on now, 3ZZZ or FM 92.3 in Melbourne. That's all we have for tonight. Join us next week with Walter Bingham, an amazing man with a lot of history, and he is happy to talk about it. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with the AJA and what we're talking about on our Facebook page. So please like it and share it widely. And as David mentioned, we want to crack that 20,000 followers very, very soon. So please share it to all of your friends. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you again next week as usual. So from me, it's bye for now. Good night.